It's all yours, Patrick.
Okay. Just a minor correction. I'm a past president of the Roundtable. Currently, other people are handling that role, but I have been. The Northern Illinois Civil War Roundtable operates in the northwest suburbs. Well, we're here tonight to talk about the North Anna. The Overland Campaign of May to June 1864 breaks down into four primary subsections: the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, and the North Anna. Well, actually, the North Anna, then Cold Harbor. I know why I just said them out of order. In his masterful campaign study, Gordon Ray committed a volume to each of these four periods. Well, then 15 years later, so later, he added a fifth volume about the move to Petersburg, but I still think of it as a campaign in four movements. Do you remember that old Sesame Street thing about one of these things is not like the other? The Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor all featured major combat involving most, if not all, of both armies and horrendous bloodshed. But the third movement, the confrontation along the North Anna River, resulted in only a few smaller clashes. Consequently, to the extent that any of the Overland Campaign is overlooked, the North Anna fits the bill. I mean, pretty much any of us can conjure up images, factoids, and whatnot about the Wilderness and Spotsylvania and Cold Harbor. But how many of you out there are familiar with Jericho Mills or Ox Ford or Chesterfield Bridge? Even Bruce Catton, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning A Stillness of Appomattox, pays scant attention to this period. His roughly 110-page coverage of the Overland Campaign includes extended detailed descriptions of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor. The North Anna segment is covered in a single sentence, or really part of a compound sentence. Catton wrote, "Strange new names were entered under the Army's annals: Ox Ford and Quarles Mill and Jericho Ford and the other crossings of the North Anna River." That's it, aside from a couple other mentions of the North Anna River in passing. When I made my first trip to that area 20 plus years ago, I too was unaware of the importance of the North Anna movement. We visited the other sites, the other three, but didn't even know that there was a state park of the North Anna. And note that that's a state park. The other three segments are all parts of national parks. The North Anna gets a state park. Instead of epic large-scale clashes, the North Anna is notable more for what didn't happen but could have. In this time period, each side would set a trap for the other side, but neither would come off. Each side would misinterpret the intentions of the other side. And perhaps most intriguingly, the two armies were probably closer in strength than any other point in the 6-week campaign. U.S. Grant launched the Overland Campaign on May 4th, 1864, crossing the Rapidan River into the Wilderness and thus flanking Lee's position behind that river. His objective was to destroy Lee's army in combat, and geographical goals, even Richmond, were merely a means to that end. He outnumbered Lee approximately 2-1 at the outset, and thus was far better supplied also, facts which are made much of by those who look to assert Lee's superiority over Grant. But using this as a yardstick ignores the advantages for Lee that were in a long way to mitigate the Union edge. Lee would spend most of the campaign having the interior lines, facilitating quick responses to Grant's moves. Lee had much better knowledge of the terrain. Once out in the Wilderness, the Army of the Potomac was covering new ground, and Union maps of the region were often problematic at best. And the geography was a great aid to Lee as well. In the Western Theater, Grant's operations were often along the axis of rivers, which could thus be used as secure supply lines. In Northern Virginia, the rivers generally flowed perpendicular to Grant's advance, becoming obstacles instead of campaign routes. Lee thus had a number of pre-existing fallback positions. Granted, Lee wasn't ordinarily one to fall back. Right at the start, rather than let Grant clear the tangled wilderness, Lee attacked there, where the Union advantages in numbers and artillery were negated. After 2 days of vicious combat, it was almost a rerun of Chancellorsville. Similar casualties on both sides, and a Union advance halted. But as we all know, Grant kept moving forward. Lee, using his interior lines to Spotsylvania, beat Grant there, where for most of 2 weeks of constant fighting, the armies battered each other as Grant tried to break Lee's army. from there to Spotsylvania. In the early going, Grant famously said the message that I will fight it out on this line if it takes all summer. But he soon realized that he was stalemated and needed to move on, both to keep the pressure on Lee and to try and draw him out into the open. This next series of moves would culminate along the North Anna River. On May 20th, Grant told his staff, "My chief anxiety now is to draw Lee out of his works and fight him in the open field instead of assaulting him behind his entrenchments." But how? After opening aggressively in the wilderness, Lee had become uncharacteristically defensive-minded. Grant would once again move to his left and force Lee to follow. Any such move threatened Richmond, but in the immediate vicinity could also threaten pose a danger to Hanover Junction just below the North Anna River. This was where two major rail lines met: the north-south Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac, and the Virginia Central, which connected Richmond to the vital granary of the Shenandoah Valley. They intersected just below the North Anna right here at Hanover Junction. It was a vital location. If Lee wanted to keep Grant a far distance from Richmond, he needed to hold that spot. Seemingly, though, if Grant made a direct move on Hanover Junction, Lee, with his interior lines, could beat the Yankees to the spot and entrench behind the river, covering all the crossings. That was the last thing Grant wanted. He figured that perhaps Lee would resort to his old pugilistic self if a juicy opportunity was offered to him. That opportunity would be offered in the form of Winfield Hancock's Second Corps. Hancock, although increasingly bothered by his Gettysburg wound, was Grant's best corps commander, and his corps had started the campaign as the best troops in the army. In 2 weeks' time, they had already taken a beating and been consolidated from 4 divisions to 3. The other corps had it rough too, but I think the Second Corps had it worst. A look at the map shows that the direct route to Hanover Junction is the Telegraph Road. From where they were up here, Telegraph Road goes straight south to Hanover Junction, which is actually off this map, but it's south of the North Anna River down here in the corner. Strikes straight down from Fredericksburg like a dagger. Leaving Hancock strung out on that road might be a little too risky, though. A route further east angles still towards Richmond, making Lee concerned about that area, but it was also sheltered by the Mattapony River. And it would also temporarily separate Hancock a little further from the army, thus maybe making him a juicier target for Robert E. Lee. So Grant sent Hancock at first along the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad instead of south. The RF&P, you can see here, bows out and then comes back around down to the North Anna. So it bows considerably east. And that's the direction he had sent Hancock at first. If Lee snapped at the bait, hopefully, then Governor Warren's Fifth Corps would go straight down Telegraph Road. If all worked well, Lee would be caught in a vice between a pincers movement between Warren and Hancock. Behind Warren, Ambrose Burnside's Ninth Corps and Horatio Wright's Sixth Corps would briefly hold in the Spotsylvania area to keep Lee from moving an entire army after Hancock, then disengage and follow the rest of the army. So it was an aggressive plan, but while aggressive, it was more cautious than Grant had been at the outset of the campaign when he just plunged into the wilderness and plunged into combat without thinking twice. The planned route used the Mattapony River as a shield. Grant wanted Lee to react, but not to cripple Hancock before the rest of the army got there. This way, if Lee attacked too soon, the Mattapony would be kind of the situation Grant faces, where the river would be across the line of advance. You'd have the Mattapony in the way. And of course, the Mattapony is formed by the Matt, the Ta, the Po, and the Nye rivers. The Matt and the Ta form the Matta, then the Matta, the Po, and the Nye all flow together, and you wind up with a Mattapony. It's kind of nice how that works out. Hancock started out briskly enough, departing at 10 p.m. on May 20th and marching deep into the night before halting. By about 9 a.m. on May 21st, the Second Corps was at Bowling Green, which is he was at Bowling Green, and then by noon he was at Milford Station. Bowling Green's over here on the edge. Milford Station's a little closer, still along the railroad there. His orders allowed him to go all the way to Hanover Junction if he felt able. But so far from the rest of the army, he was unwilling to risk it. Lee's initial response was limited. He had reports that Hancock was moving, but as best as he could tell, there was still plenty of Federals left at Spotsylvania. A year earlier, Lee had divided his smaller army multiple times in the face of the enemy and won a smashing victory at Chancellorsville. But he wasn't facing Joe Hooker now. Lee was also no longer masked by the wilderness, and after Gettysburg, Wilderness, and Spotsylvania, his army wasn't the offensive juggernaut it had been. And, once already in this campaign, Lee had guessed wrongly at evidence of Grant's moves right before the Muleshoe attack on May 12th. That had almost ended in disaster. So Lee's initial counter would also be cautious, but it still threw a monkey wrench into Grant's plans. He pulled his smallest corps, Richard Ewell's 2nd Corps, out of the lines, moved it to Mud Tavern on Telegraph Road. Just up here in the center part there. Ewell reached there by 10 a.m. on the 21st. This way, he could block the direct road to Hanover Junction and perhaps give Hancock second thoughts as to moving any further. Well, Grant's always ready to adjust his plans on the fly. He altered Warren's intended route a little to the east, crossing the Mattapony at Guinea Station instead, and coming in towards Ewell's flank. Grant and Meade traveled with Warren's column. Early in the move, the generals halted for a couple hours at Masseponax Church, where they pulled church pews out into the yard and discussed plans. A photographer set up inside the church and took a few images that have since become famous. You all have probably seen these over the years. These were taken on May 21st at Masseponax Church and the early stages of the North Anna movement. Meanwhile, having finally left Spotsylvania, Burnside's 9th Corps swung behind Warren and then started south along Telegraph Road. They came up at lightly held works along the Po River, which is part of Ewell's roadblock. So Burnside got to the Po River and stopped right there. I don't know if you all can see the cursor, but I hope you can. During this same time, Lee had become convinced that Grant was indeed moving his whole army from Spotsylvania, ordered Ewell to leave enough men to hold his little roadblock, and he sent the rest of the corps south towards Hanover Junction. Following Ewell, east and then south would be Dick Anderson and 1st Corps. And to avoid overcrowding the roads and also to keep the wagons safe and keep them further off the main battle line, A.P. Hill with the wagons would move further to the west. So in sum total, this intricate series of moves by both sides on May 21st had the Army of Northern Virginia spread out along 15 miles of terrain and the Army of the Potomac covering about 20 miles. And in places, such right around Mud Tavern and the roadblock there, they were very close to each other. Both sides, over the course of the day, had opportunities to damage the opposition. On the Confederate side, once Lee was sure Grant was leaving Spotsylvania, and before he sent Anderson to follow Ewell, he could perhaps have launched Hill and Anderson in a crushing attack on the tail of Grant's army. Or, when Ewell reached Mud Tavern, Lee could have left the whole corps there and struck the head of either Warren's column or Burnside's column. On the Union side, Grant could have had Warren or Wright pitch into Ewell's flank at Mud Tavern, while Ewell and Anderson were on the move south. Or even combined Warren and Wright against Ewell. For much of the day, 2 Confederate corps were spread out on road columns, well within range of Federal forces. Meanwhile, Hancock crossed the Mattapony at Milford Station down here, but then halted and threw up defensive works after being confronted by a small collection of infantry and cavalry. He could have pushed aggressively through this small force. But none of these opportunities was taken by either side. Things were wide open on May 21st, about as wide open as they'd be for the entire campaign. But neither general did anything. Gordon Ray points out in his Cold Harbor volume that Grant and Lee were very similar generals. Both liked to use maneuver to set up hammer blows against the enemy. The key attribute of both was aggressiveness. On May 21st, their similarity instead extended to unusual caution. Grant had put Hancock at risk, but with the hedge of the Mattapony to shield him. Lee had seemingly never even considered the offensive on this day. Both generals were at least as concerned about what the enemy could do to them as what they could do to the enemy, which is kind of in direct contrast of Grant's off-stated preference. To me, they seem very much like boxers who, after going whole hog for several rounds, were now warily and wearily circling each other in the middle rounds. Another reason for the missed opportunities was the lack of cavalry on both sides. Right after the Wilderness, Philip Sheridan had launched his powerful cavalry raid towards Richmond, taking almost all of Grant's cavalry and a good portion of Lee's cavalry. Although the Confederates retained more horsemen than the Federals did, neither side really had enough scouts to be fully apprised of the enemy's dispositions, and thus of some of these opportunities. But really, it was the wariness and the fatigue of the high command in both sides that was the main culprit for the opportunities of May 21st to fall by the wayside. Gordon Ray writes of this day, May 21st represents a low point for both generals. Each seemed governed by concern over what the other might do, and each missed chances to strike telling blows. On May 22nd, Lee won the race to the North Anna River. Ewell, having drawn close the previous day while he strung out along Telegraph Road, reached the area first with Anderson following. But Grant's cautious advance to the southeast led Lee to misinterpret his intentions. He decided that Grant was fully committed to continuing to sidle southeast towards the Pamunkey River rather than considering coming straight at the North Anna. The next morning, on the 23rd, Lee would telegraph Jefferson Davis that Grant was using the Mattapony as a shield in order to, quote, recruit and reorganize his army, which, as far as I am able to judge, has been very much shaken, end quote. Well, back to the 22nd here. Waiting for A.P. Hill's approach from further west, Lee decided to have his weary troops rest. So he's got Anderson and Ewell south of the North Anna River now. But he's letting them rest. No setting up of defensive positions, no digging earthworks. Once Grant's route southeast was fully developed, they would need their strength to make counter moves. This was a dangerous level of risk by Lee, should Grant decide to strike straight south toward the North Anna instead. And he intended to do just that. Continuing southeast towards the Pamunkey was a safer approach, and one that George Meade favored. That would force Lee closer to Richmond. But Grant's overriding concern in this campaign was the destruction of Lee's army, not specifically pressing him back to Richmond. While he would have preferred that Lee fight him in the open north of the river, Grant could at least count on Lee giving battle at the North Anna. So on the 22nd of May, which is the moves we're seeing on this map here, Grant reconcentrated his army, which is lead elements about 5 miles from the North Anna crossing at Chesterfield on the Telegraph Road. It was a slow move, dogged by delaying actions by rebel detachments, as well as fatigue. At one stretch over this couple of days here, 6th Corps got no rest for about 36 hours, or more than 30 hours at least. Maps were also a problem. Caroline County was new territory for Union armies, and the marches were complicated by roads that weren't where they're supposed to be, creeks whose existence was not on the maps, and other problems. On the other hand, the new territory was unspoiled by war, providing both nice scenery and plenty of opportunities for foraging. Meanwhile, south of the river, A.P. Hill moved southeast along the Virginia Central, rejoining the rest of Lee's army. As May 22nd came to a close, the stage was set for combat along the North Anna River. Whether it would be the decisive confrontation Grant desired remained to be seen. It's worth a brief pause here to look at the armies on the eve of battle. In just over 2 weeks, both had been mauled and partially reorganized. The Army of Northern Virginia had been around 60,000 strong when the overland campaign commenced. It had been whittled down to about 40,000 in the maelstrom of the Wilderness and Spotsylvania. Hardest hit was Dick Ewell's corps, which had lost most of one entire division, including his commander Ed Johnson, at the Mule Shoe. Lee also had lost his top corps commander, James Longstreet, badly wounded by his own troops in the Wilderness. He wouldn't be back until the fall. Much of Lee's numerical losses had been made good by late May. The failures of Grant's two ancillary offensives that spring, Franz Sigel in the Shenandoah and Ben Butler on the James River, freed up John Breckinridge's division from the Valley, Robert Hoke's former brigade from the Petersburg front, and a Maryland brigade. Additionally, George Pickett's division, which had spent the beginning of the campaign in Richmond, was sent to Lee with two of its brigades were among the troops that gave Hancock pause when he crossed the Mattapony at Milford Station. Combined, these troops added about 13,300 veterans to Lee's ranks, giving him a little over 53,000 as May 23rd dawned. The Army of the Potomac, as the attacker, had been hurt even worse. Starting around 120,000 men on May 4th, Grant had taken approximately 36,000 casualties thus far. The temporary absence of Sheridan's cavalry on his raid dropped another 11,000 men. Detachments to guard rear areas, and even more so, expired enlistments were a steady drain. Grant did receive some reinforcement, mostly draftees and heavy artillery regiments from the Washington defenses, giving Grant about 68,000 men at this point. Unlike Lee's accessions, Grant's were largely inexperienced. The heavy artillery units always fascinate me. They force me to digress a little here. They became an increasing presence in the Army of the Potomac as 1864 wore on. They were large, often over 800 men, which is probably 3 times the average regiment at this point in the war. They were trained to man the heavy guns in the Washington defenses, but also trained as infantry, while retaining their nomenclature as artillery and their red uniform trimming instead of the light blue of infantry. Early in the spring, Grant also put some dismounted cavalry units that had no horses into infantry brigades. One day before campaigning began, a heavy artillery unit ran into a dismounted cavalry regiment and decided to give them a little grief. So they asked him where their horses were. The cavalryman promptly replied, "Gone back to fetch your heavy guns." The heavy's first big test was on May 19th, when Grant was preparing to leave Spotsylvania and Ewell was sent on a recon to find out what was going on. Ewell launched a strong attack, and a number of the new heavies saw their first combat, taking some significant losses, but playing a key role in beating Ewell back. One of their officers reported, "Well, after a few minutes, they got a little mixed and didn't fight very tactically, but they fought confounded plucky." A division of 5 such regiments was part of the reorganization of Hancock's Second Corps, putting it back to 4 divisions again after it had 3. Meanwhile, Warren's Fifth Corps had been reduced from 4 divisions to 3, and like Lee, Grant had lost a veteran corps commander, John Sedgwick, at Spotsylvania. I'm sure most of us know Sedgwick's last words. With both armies having suffered considerably on manpower and leadership, here at the North Anna they were remarkably close in strength, 68,000 to 53,000. Not exactly the overwhelming Union hordes of legend. Although small in size, the North Anna River itself was a formidable obstacle thanks to steep banks, limiting the crossings near Hanover Junction to very few. And of course, the northern maps had those wrong. Even though the RF&P Railroad crossed the river directly north of Hanover Junction, Union information identified the Telegraph Road crossing as a ford, when in fact it was a bridge. A second known crossing further west was Ox Ford. Beyond that, Federal Intel placed a bridge at Jericho Mills. In reality, this was a ford. As Grant moved on the morning of May 23rd, maps continued to be a problem. Warren and Hancock converged on Mount Carmel Church and found that the road network didn't match their maps at all. On the fly, Warren gave Hancock the direct route south to the supposed Chesterfield Ford, while he moved west towards Jericho Mills. This decision was later approved by Grant and Meade, still miles to the rear. And then it was planned to have Wright follow Warren, and Burnside would move to Ox Ford in the Union Center. By early afternoon, slowed somewhat by some of Wade Hampton's horsemen, Hancock reached and crossed the North Anna, or so he thought and reported. Instead, he had encountered Long Creek, which wasn't on Union maps at all. Soon enough, the error was discovered, and Second Corps pressed south. They discovered instead of the expected ford, Chesterfield Bridge, with a small earthwork guarding it. This is Chesterfield Bridge, taken not long after the fighting, and you can kind of see in the horizon here. You can see a little bit of a bump up in the terrain on the horizon. That is the redoubt, the earthworks covering the crossing, the Chesterfield Bridge crossing of the North Anna. On the south side of the river, headquartered at the Fox House, Lee received word of the skirmishing marking Hancock's approach. Even now, he was still convinced that Grant's intended thrust was to the southeast, and this was just a feint. When Union artillery opened up, shells hit the Fox property, demolishing 10 feet of its chimney and killing a member of Lee's staff. Lee was forced to evacuate while rebel artillery was brought up to counter the Yankee guns. Lee's troops south of the river were still bivouacked near Hanover Junction, except for a brigade of South Carolinians from Joseph Kershaw's division of Anderson's corps. Led by Colonel John Hennigan, they occupied the earthwork guarding the Chesterfield Bridge and fanned out to both sides of it. And now, in late afternoon, they warily watched as a host of bluecoats shook out into formation. Hancock placed John Gibbon's division east of the railroad, Francis Barlow's division to Gibbon's right, David Birney to Barlow's right, and Robert Tyler's division of recently bloodied heavy artillerymen in reserve. It fell on Birney to attack the earthwork. Whoops, I hit the wrong place. There we go. Birney used 3 of his brigades in a pincer movement, hitting the front and both flanks of the South Carolinians. While with the formation overlapping Hennigan's flanks on both sides, at 6:30 p.m. on the 23rd, Birney's attack launched. 3 brigades were too strong for 4 regiments. The flanks broke first, then the Yankees stormed the earthwork itself, which ever after will be known as Hennigan's Redoubt. South Carolinians fled to and into the river, many being shot down in the process. As the regiments regrouped south of the river, Hancock seized Chesterfield Bridge, though the Southerners did manage to burn the railroad bridge. At a cost of 285 Union casualties to 150 plus Confederates, the North Anna River barrier had now been breached. And not just in one place. Warren's orders would have moved so as to cover Jericho Mills Bridge, which, as previously mentioned, turned out to be a ford. There was only a smattering of home guards present, which quickly melted back into the forest. Warren saw an opportunity to seize the crossing even without orders. After sending a request back to Grant for permission to cross, Warren, in an unusually bold move for him, didn't wait for permission, but crossed the ford, which was 4 feet deep with a rocky bottom, and built a pontoon bridge, also improving the steep approaches on both sides, so that artillery and wagons could use the pontoon bridge. This is the crossing at Ox Ford. I mean, at Jericho Mills. The mill is here. I think this is looking, I don't remember which way this looks, but you can see how high the bank is. The pontoon bridge is there. And it'd be a pretty steep climb up and down, whether you're coming down to get on the bridge or going up to get to the position of the troops after they cross. Quickly seizing the high ground, Warren began placing his divisions in line, intending to entrench a position between the riverbanks. Because, as you'll see in the next map, Ox Ford position is kind of in a bend of the river. But his efforts would be violently interrupted. South of the river, another brigade of South Carolinians, this time Brown's brigade of Cadmus Wilcox's division and A.P. Hill's corps, was nearby, serving as a flank guard for the rest of the division. Brown's outposts saw the Federal crossing begin before scampering away. Their report and intel from Confederate cavalry informed Wilcox that a couple of cavalry brigades had crossed the river. On his own, Wilcox decided to launch his whole division at the crossing, unaware that he was about to attack an entire corps. But it was a corps that was unprepared. Little dreaming that an entire division was in the vicinity, Warren's troops were taking their time forming the intended line. Samuel Crawford's division on the left was anchored on the river, with Charles Griffin's division next in line partially dug in. But Lysander Cutler's division was not on line yet. Furthermore, many of the troops in all three units had taken their arms, had their arms stacked and were making cooking fires. There's the ford and the bend in the river that supposedly he was going to anchor on. Wilcox struck at 6 p.m., roughly about a half hour before Birney is charging Chesterfield Bridge and the Hannigan Redoubt a few miles away. His right brigades hitting the front of Griffin and Crawford, while his left brigades overlapped the Union right. 16 Confederate guns dueled overhead with Union guns stationed on the north bank. At least one veteran saying it was heavy artillery fire than anything the men had seen except for Gettysburg. Sam Crawford was so shocked that, uncharacteristically for him, he jumped on his horse and rode for the rear. His brigadiers, left on their own hook, managed to hold firm. But not so the elements of Cutler that were trying to form on Griffin's right. Both the legendary Iron Brigade, which granted was a shadow of its former self by now, and a brigade of Pennsylvania bucktails were sent streaming to the rear, some of them even crowding back across the pontoon bridge. So you see these two brigades on the left here overlapped, and right here in the center, Cutler's division was not formed, and they got hit hard. But Jacob Schweitzer's brigade refused its flank. Joseph Bartlett's brigade counterattacked, and 3 batteries that had crossed earlier slammed Wilcox's left. A gap developed in Wilcox's division as the 2 right brigades ran up against solid Union lines, and the 2 left brigades had pushed further and become separated. With the left now being savaged by the counterattack and by the guns, and the right being stalled, Wilcox had to pull back, ending his attack. It had been a near disaster for 5th Corps, but they had held with relatively light casualties, 350 or so to about 730 rebel losses. Warren was now able to finish his line once the Battle of Jericho Mills ended, holding another intact bridgehead over the North Anna, with 6th Corps coming up behind him. The next morning, Lee would lash out at A.P. Hill. "Why did you let those people cross here? Why didn't you throw your whole force on them and drive them back as Jackson would have done?" That wasn't fair to Hill. Lee had won the race to the North Anna, but had then misread Grant's intentions and had neglected to adequately block the crossings. Now the river line was broken. What was Lee to do? Anyone recognize this handsome guy here? If I was in the room there presenting in person, I'd pause for an answer, but it's hard to do that by Zoom. This is one of the unsung heroes of the Overland Campaign. It's the Army of North Virginia's chief engineer, Major General Martin Luther Smith. He's mostly known for having commanded a division in the Vicksburg campaign, though his was one of the 2 divisions left in the city while Pemberton moved out to Champion Hill. Thus, Smith only saw action during the siege. Later, after surrendering and being paroled, he moved east for his duties called him east. In the Overland Campaign, Martin L. Smith had 2 great moments. At the Wilderness, it was Smith who alerted Lee to the unfinished railroad cut that some of Longstreet's men used for a flank attack on the 2nd day of the Wilderness. Here, Smith came up with the answer to Lee's problem, and an ingenious answer it was. Even had Chesterfield Bridge not fallen, it was a difficult crossing to defend indefinitely because the northern bank was much higher than the southern. And Jericho Mills Ford was gone, Warren being firmly ensconced on the south side. In between these was the key to the entire position, Oxford. At Oxford, the crossing was better than that at Jericho Mills, but the south bank was much higher than the north. An entrenched position here would be virtually impregnable, and as long as the Confederates held Oxford, the Union Army would be split into 3 parts thanks to the course of the North Anna River. So this is what Smith did. His idea was to entrench Lee's army in an inverted V, with both wings drawn away from the river crossings, except for at Ox Ford. The lack of resistance at Jericho Mills Ford and Chesterfield Bridge could entice Union movements on both flanks. But as long as Ox Ford was blocked, Grant could not reunite his army. Right here in the center is Ox Ford, at the tip of this inverted V. Lee could use the earthworks as a shield from which to launch an attack on one wing or the other. With two river crossings between the wings, it would be impossible for Grant to quickly reinforce a flank that was in trouble. You can see that here. If he attacks Warren, Hancock's got to move guys across this river, across this river. It's a very difficult thing to do. Perpendicular to the Virginia Central Railroad is a low ridge, along which A.P. Hill dug in, the left flank of the Confederates, with his right at Ox Ford and his left anchored on Little River over here. Dick Anderson and Dick Ewell formed the right wing, bent back towards Hanover Junction. Breckinridge's and Pickett's divisions, as well as John Gordon's of Ewell's corps, were placed in reserve. On May 24th, this position took place as planned. Now it was up to Grant to walk into the trap. That walk began the morning of the 24th. Both Warren on the western flank and Hancock on the eastern flank were surprised to see no enemy entrenchments confronting them. Each corps started probing cautiously forward. As 5th and 2nd Corps advanced, Wright crossed Jericho Mills Ford behind Warren, while Burnside lent one division to Hancock and was supposed to supply Hancock with any help that he needed. If possible, based on Hancock's needs, Old Byrne would also take Ox Ford, reuniting the army south of the river. The initial lack of opposition on the wings produced some optimism and confusion on the Union High Command. Had Lee pulled back to the South Anna River? Had he drawn off towards Richmond? Burnside was the first to discover that neither of these things was true. Having sent one division east to help Hancock, he sent Orlando Wilcox's division to seize Ox Ford, where they discovered the imposing enemy works behind that ford. Burnside described the position as, quote, densely wooded along its bank, with high ground in rear, with one battery in position, flanked by rifle pits, and it is reported there is another line of rifle pits in front. He concluded that the prospects of success are not all that flattering. Several attempts to cross were thrown back. Despite orders to cross Ox Ford by the end of the day and camp south of the river, the direct approach would never work. Hancock, too, soon found the lack of resistance was an illusion. As he pressed forward south of the river, rebel artillery near Ox Ford fired east and pinned part of his corps down on an open field. His move was halted. Warren, too, would eventually run up against resistance on his wing. Burnside thought he had found a solution. He received word of a previously unknown ford at Quarles Mill, upstream from Ox Ford. Burnside reasoned that he could use this to flank the Ox Ford defenses. Thomas Crittenden's division was sent to the ford, which, if anything, was a tougher crossing than Jericho Mills. The men had to hold their cartridge boxes over their shoulders to keep their ammunition dry. In case you were wondering, or maybe even if you weren't wondering, this is the same Tom Crittenden who had been a corps commander from Perryville through Chickamauga out in the Army of the Ohio/Cumberland. You will sometimes read that Crittenden's Civil War career, as well as that of fellow corps commander Alex McCook, ended when they were swept off the Chickamauga battlefield. But Crittenden saw service in divisional command during the latter part of the Overland Campaign, while McCook would be involved in the defense of Washington against Jubal Early in July. The lead brigade of Crittenden's division was led by this guy. And again, were we in person, I'd ask if anybody knew who he was. This is the soon-to-be infamous James Ledlie. Here on the evening of May 24th, he demonstrated his unfitness for brigade command. Apparently several sheets to the wind, Ledlie observed the strong works occupied by Billy Mahone's division of Hill's Corps and decided he could take them. Asking Crittenden for reinforcements, Ledlie boasted that he could take the enemy works. Crittenden denied the request, ordering Ledlie to, quote, use the utmost caution. In such a state of excitement that one observer doubted Ledlie even fully heard, much less understood Crittenden's response, Ledlie recklessly charged forward with his brigade. As the assault stepped off, a tremendous thunderstorm opened, adding to the hell of battle. Rebels by the river fired into his flank, artillery crashed into his front, and when the brigade recoiled, regiments left the Confederate works and smashed into both of Ledlie's flanks. The brigade fled back to its starting point, where it hunkered down next to Sam Crawford's 5th Corps Division. So much for James Ledlie's big move. Donna Neary's painting, Even to Hell Itself, is the only painting in existence of the North Anna operations. It depicts the 57th Massachusetts wavering amidst the thunderstorm and about to be sent packing. Ledlie's unauthorized attack was an utter failure and a useless effusion of blood. He lost about 450 men to maybe 75 Confederates. Rather than being punished, perhaps even cashiered for this drunken escapade, James Ledlie would not only remain in brigade command, but would take over the division when Crittenden resigned in June. I think we know where this path led to at Petersburg. Lee's trap had worked thus far. 6 miles and 2 river crossings separated the wings of Grant's army, and both wings were in the open and not dug in. Now was the time to exploit the enemy's vulnerability, to launch an attack on one wing or the other. But no attack came. Robert E. Lee had not been well. An intestinal illness had been beset him. Recently, he had been moving about by ambulance rather than on horseback. The strain of the last few weeks, heavy losses in personnel and even more so in subordinate leadership, coupled with uneven performances from existing corps commanders, had taken its toll. Receiving reports of the Union advances and the fight at Ox Ford, Lee could only I'm sorry, I jumped there. Now, here on the 24th, the illness intensified. Lee was unable to even leave his tent. He was unable to do more than communicate via couriers. This situation was one which really needed Lee's close attention, and he simply could not function at that level. Receiving reports of the Union advances and the fight at Ox Ford, Lee could only, in a state of near delirium, repeatedly intone, "We must strike them a blow. We must not allow them to pass us. We must strike them a blow." Meanwhile, having finally awakened to the danger Lee had put him in, Grant instructed the wings to entrench, confronting the newly formed enemy position. Once under the shelter of earthworks, the Yankees were no longer in danger from Lee's army. The opportunity to strike them a blow had passed. While safe from Confederate attack, Grant, nonetheless, was unable to strike Lee's ingenious position with any chance of success either. After the two armies confronted each other in a stalemate for a couple of days, Grant, now with Sheridan's cavalry back from its Richmond area raid, resumed sidling to his left to the southeast, with Lee following. This would lead to the environs of the 1862 Peninsula Campaign, and ultimately to the slaughter at Cold Harbor. Lee's failure to either snap at Hancock's bait at the outset of this operation, or to spring the trap Grant had walked into, gave Grant a misleading perception of the state of Lee's army. Grant would report that Lee's army is really whipped. The prisoners we now take show it, and the action of his army shows it unmistakably. This belief would have repercussions at Cold Harbor. The 4 days of May 21st to May 24th, 1863, were an unusually fluid phase of the overland campaign. As we've seen here, there was a lot of potential on both sides during this period, but that potential went unfulfilled. The decisive battle sought by Grant yielded only 3 smaller confrontations: Hennigan's Redoubt, aka Chesterfield Bridge, Jericho Mills, and Ox Ford. These 3 combats produced roughly 1,100 Federal and maybe 1,000 Confederate casualties. Beyond that, there were some minor skirmishing losses on both sides during this period. This lack of major combat is probably why the North Anna operations were underrepresented in historical accounts for so long. After all, as they say, if it bleeds, it leads. But the North Anna finally got its due. It is the primary focus of the third volume of Gordon Ray's series, as I mentioned. Warning, if you buy this one, To the North Anna River by Gordon C. Ray, you will want to get the other 3 books. It's really impossible to read one of those books without reading all 4. Or, if you want a shorter but still lively and informative read, Chris Makowski's account of the emerging Civil War series, naturally titled Strike Them a Blow, fits the bill. And for those of you who like coffee table style books, The North Anna has its proper place in Ray's beautifully illustrated Footsteps book, which covers the whole campaign, but not nearly in depth as the others, but also with a lot of great illustrations. Any and all 3 of these would be great ways to learn more about the North Anna operations. Well, I hope that those who didn't know anything about the North Anna know a little more, and those who did haven't found me making too many mistakes. Thank you for your time.